Good evening. I'm Ruth Bergman, Director of Education at the Holocaust Memorial Center. I'd like to welcome everyone to tonight's talk, especially our museum members and donors. Your support has allowed us to provide complimentary virtual programming all year. We truly appreciate your generosity. A special thank you to program supporters Robin and Leo Eisenberg, and to our community partners, the Detroit VA Healthcare System, Jewish War Veterans of the United States Department of Michigan, and the Yankee Air Museum. It is my honor to introduce our speaker tonight. Rick Beyer is an award-winning documentary filmmaker, a New York Times bestselling author, and a longtime history enthusiast. He produced and directed the PBS documentary, The Ghost Army, and has made documentary films for the History Channel and National Geographic. His most recent book, Rivals Unto Death, Hamilton and Burr, explores the three-decade rivalry that led to their infamous duel. Rick is also the author of the popular Greatest Stories Never Told series of history books. I am pleased to welcome Mr. Rick Beyer.
Well, thank you so much, and it's great to be here. I hope you guys can all hear me. We've got such a great crowd tonight. And before I start, I want to introduce somebody whose picture was up here a minute ago as one of the panelists, and I hope he'll come back in, and we'll see him in a moment. But we have one of the veterans of the Ghost Army here with us today, Seymour Nussenbaum. And even if you can't see him, know that he's here watching the show. Seymour's 98 years old. He lives in Monroe Township, New Jersey. And he is with us tonight. And we hope he has also, in addition to sharing some things, he's also got a great connection with the memorial. And so we're going to share that, something we just discovered a couple of days ago. So we'll save Seymour for the Q&A. And if you have any questions for him, you can ask about them. But I will talk about him a little bit before we get there. For now, I want you to imagine yourself in the position that Seymour and his fellow soldiers found themselves in during the war. The year is 1944. You're in the Army and you get your orders. You're headed to the front, but you're not going to be driving a tank or firing an M1 rifle. Your mission is to put on a show for the enemy. You must stage a complex multimedia presentation spread out over many miles, and do so right in the middle of a war zone. It must be utterly convincing to an attentive and discerning audience that wants nothing more than to kill you. Your life depends on how good a job you do, and so do thousands of other lives. And next week, you'll be asked to do it again. And that, in a nutshell, was the mission handed to the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops in World War II, a boring name for a really extraordinary unit that we know today as the Ghost Army. And to carry out that mission, they used inflatable tanks, sound effects, radio trickery, and impersonation. And then the details of their operations were hushed up for more than 50 years. The war against the Nazis took many forms, but perhaps none is more extraordinary than this one. I first came across this story in 2005 when I met a woman whose uncle served in the unit, and I was blown away. I had never heard of it. I certainly had heard of the famous D-Day deception, Operation Fortitude, as I'm sure many of you have, the British deception to fool the Germans about where the D-Day landings would take place. But this is a completely different story. An all-American tale, 1,100 men staging a traveling roadshow of deception up and down the front lines, sometimes right near the front lines. This was a revelation. So I began to do research, interview veterans, and start working on a documentary film that eventually aired on PBS and has been seen around the world. So I've been pursuing this story for 16 years now. But at some point, things got turned around and the Ghost Army started pursuing me. The documentary led to a book. The book led to a movie deal, no movie yet, a Ghost Army tour, a museum exhibit, new discoveries, student projects with National History Day, all sorts of amazing stuff. It's even brought me to Congress, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. And back in the day, I had no idea I was headed out on a 16-year mission that would still be ongoing all these years later. But that is indeed the power of the Ghost Army. So let's get to it. What makes this story so fascinating? Well, I am going to now share my screen. It's always that bold moment, that scary moment that we find out if things are going to work the way we hope they are. And we push some buttons and we see what happens. And look, there's my screen, and hopefully it's got on it everything we need, and we shall start. And we'll start with the mission of this unit. And the mission, of course, of the Ghost Army was deception. And these particular deceptions involved impersonation, impersonating other much larger American units to fool the Germans about the location and intentions of those units. So it might seem like the Americans are headed in this direction, when in fact they're really headed the other way in this direction. And they carried out these deceptions. It wasn't just one deception, not two deceptions. There were more than 20 different deceptions that the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops carried out. And this is the cover of their official history in the National Archives. Used to be top secret, now declassified. And it has on it the insignia of all the units they impersonated or were attached to during the war. And for the record, there's 36 insignia around the edges. And so they got around. So how did they do it? Well, the Ghost Army used a multimedia approach and went to war armed with three kinds of deception: visual, sonic, and radio. And visual deception is probably what they are best known for, using inflatable dummies to fool enemy aerial reconnaissance. Inflatable dummies like this dummy Sherman tank. This is actually a replica. It's not one of the real ones. Here's what one of the real ones looked like. They had hundreds of these, and not just tanks, but in fact, almost every vehicle that an armored or infantry division would have. For example, inflatable artillery of every description, inflatable trucks. There's 3 trucks in this picture, by the way. 2 of them just happen to be in bags still. So you can take hundreds of these items and you can paint the landscape with a 3D masterpiece. And to give you an example, this is an aerial photo of a real Ghost Army operation along the Rhine River in 1945. And every single vehicle in this photograph is inflated. Just stop and think about that for a minute. And this is maybe a few miles from where the Germans are. Now, this photo holds a critical lesson for any of you who might be planning a career in deception. What makes it look so real? I hope you're not planning a career in deception. But anyway, what makes it look so real? Well, the answer, of course, is the tank tracks. It turns out that a 40-ton Sherman tank makes a heck of an impression in the ground, especially the muddy spring ground that this is in March 1945, where a 90-pound dummy, not so much. So they had to have a company of engineers with bulldozers. They had 3 bulldozers, and they used these to make the tank tracks out to each tank, to sort of literally paint them into the ground. That's the kind of attention to detail that deception requires. Because if you had a tank that didn't have any tank tracks to it, that would be suspicious. And then the enemy might catch on to the whole thing. So attention to detail is critical. Now, the soldiers who worked with the dummies found it an incredibly memorable experience. I'll let them tell you about it.
It was a little bundle of stuff, which a tank was in, all compressed before you opened the bundle, spread the nozzles around, and inflated it.
Pulling this amorphic shape out of it, and then watching it being filled with air and taking form, like a monster.
If things went very well, there were air compressors. If things went not so well, there were bicycle pumps. And if things went terribly badly, there were our lungs.
In most cases, like a German tank, we could have it inflated and moved within 15 or 20 minutes.
The artillery piece was good. The Jeep was good. But that M4 tank, that was the beauty. That was a piece of work. It really was.
Now, oops, flip back here accidentally for a moment. Anyway, the veterans who I talked to shared many stories with me about working with these inflatable tanks. And my favorite is one that happened to a soldier named Arthur Shilstone. It was relatively early in their time in Europe, and they were, excuse me, inflating the tanks. And of course, they would set up a security perimeter around this to make sure that nobody got through. Prying eyes didn't see what was going on. But somehow, a couple of Frenchmen on bicycles got past the security perimeter, and Arthur, who was on guard duty, it was his job to shoo them away. And as he told me the story, he said, they weren't looking at me. They were looking over my shoulder. And what they thought they saw was 4 GIs lifting a 40-ton Sherman tank and turning it around. And they were looking at me, said Arthur, and they were looking for answers. And finally, I said, the Americans are very strong. So that's visual deception. That's the first part of the triad of deception they went to war with. The second part is sonic deception. This involves using recorded sounds to fool the enemy. A brand new technology and piece of war making in 1944. So what the men of this unit did is they recorded their own collection of sound effects records here in the United States before they went to Europe. Not sounds of battle, but all sorts of other sounds. Sounds of tanks on the move, trucks on the move, jeeps, digging in, assembling pontoon bridges, just about everything that you can imagine. And when they got to Europe, if they were doing a particular deception, let's say this deception involves tanks, coming up a hill and stopping for a while and then moving on, they would mix the appropriate sounds together and record them on a wire recorder to play for the show. A wire recorder. I'm guessing only a few of you even can kind of come up with a dim image of that technology. It's the predecessor to the tape recorder. Let me give you a little clue here. Here's what one of those wires looks like. It's a magnetized wire about the consistency of fishing line. And to have 30 minutes of sound takes 2 minutes. That's 2 miles of wire. So it's quite a lot of wire to have 30 minutes of sound. And they would play these wire recorders and the sounds out 500-pound speakers mounted on the backs of half-cabs. The speakers had a range of about 15 miles, but oftentimes I've actually been to some of the spots where they were deployed. They pushed them right up close to the front. The sonic guys were often just a few hundred yards away from the front. And by all accounts, this was an incredibly effective means of deception. I mean, it's theater of the mind. Imagine you're a lonely German sentry at night hearing all these sounds, and you think, my goodness, the Americans must be coming in droves. And one of the officers in the sonic unit was a self-described kid from the Bronx, Lieutenant Dick Syracuse. And he told me that on some of these deceptions, after a while, he began to see tanks, even though he knew they weren't there. He said he could see them. It was psychologically unnerving. He also told me a great story about one night when they were up near the German lines playing their sound effects, and he got a surprise visitor, a colonel from a nearby American armored cav unit operating in the same vicinity. I'll let him tell you.
This one particular night, we're playing a concert, as we would refer to it. All of a sudden, storming up the road, this guy looked like a monster because he had a flak jacket on, and there were hand grenades hanging, and carrying a Thompson submachine gun. And he sees, "Lieutenant," "Yes, sir." "What the hell's going on here, son?" I said, "Well, what do you mean, Colonel?" He says, "Well, what are them tanks doing here?" I said, "Well, there aren't really any tanks." "Well, some expletives suitable to the occasion." And he said, the gist of it was, "Don't tell me, I know what I hear. There are tanks out there, and nobody told me there was going to be a tank." And I explained to him about the sonic vehicles and what they were doing and why. So his parting words is, "Well, son," he says, "you certainly could have fooled me."
I think my favorite part of this story is the expletives suitable to the occasion, or expletives, as one might say. But it's a funny story, but also is a reality here, which is it's very important to coordinate your deceptions with real units that are in the vicinity. Failing to do so can definitely lead to problems. So that's sonic deception. The third type of deception they used was radio deception. And it's a pretty simple idea. If you can replicate the radio signals of a real unit, you can make it seem like it's really there to anybody who's listening in. I mean, think about it. An American Army unit is operating in France. The division headquarters has a radio. The regimental headquarters have radios. Battalion, company, all have radios. If you can replicate that radio network, sending messages to each other, it's going to seem to someone listening as if the unit is really there, even if they're coded messages and the enemy can't understand them. Then if you further tie your fake radio network into the real radio networks, it's seamless. It's just going to make it absolutely obvious to enemy intelligence that a unit is really there. Radio doesn't get as much attention as some of the other means of deception the Ghost Army used, which is too bad because it was probably one of their most effective tools that they had at their command. I want to point something out in this picture. This gentleman standing by the truck here is Stanley Nance, and this is his radio truck, which he nicknamed Kilowatt Command, and he made this little pennant to go on the antenna of Kilowatt Command. And Stanley lives in Utah. He's still alive. He's 103 years old. And I'll show a picture of him a little bit later on so you get to see what he looks like today. Again, though, we see here attention to detail is important. All of these messages are sent by telegraph, or almost all of them, Morse code, dots and dashes. And German intelligence was so sophisticated, they could recognize the sending style of individual American operators. So if it's a guy from the 119th Regiment of the 30th Division, they knew what that guy sounded like. So the Ghost Army radio operators had to mimic, they had to learn the sending style of the person they're impersonating and mimic that sending style. So it's not just as simple as, oh, we'll throw some radio on the air. It's actually learning to mimic the sending styles of individual operators so that that attention to detail is what's going to convince the enemy. Okay, in June 1944, a few weeks after D-Day, the 1,100 men of the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops go into action in France, in Normandy, armed with three types of deception, the three types described. But once on the ground in Europe, they realize they're missing something. As they start to do their first deceptions in June and July, they realize something is missing. And it's not the brass that figures it out. Of course it's not. It's the enlisted men and the junior officers, the guys on the ground doing the work, who figured it out. And it was a young lieutenant named Fred Fox, who interestingly enough was Princeton 39, a musical theater guy at Princeton, tried to make it in Hollywood, didn't quite make it. But it's Fred Fox who puts his finger on what's wrong. He says, we need to be more theatrical. Actually sends a memo to the commanding officer saying we need to be more theatrical. And so they developed a fourth type of deception called special effects. And it involved turning every one of them into actors.
Moving through the French villages so recently occupied by the Germans, they saw an opportunity to improvise yet another way to sell their deceptions, targeting enemy spies that might have stayed behind. They called it special effects.
Why don't we put a stencil of the name of the unit that we were simulating right on the trucks? And why don't we start a counterfeit shoulder patch factory where they would see we were the 75th Division, one of the divisions we did?
So we began to put on their patches and put their bumper markings on, and we physically assumed the role only for every 100 of them, there might be 10 of us.
My shirts were all wrecked from having sewn so many different shoulder patches on them.
They even set up phony command posts, and against all Army regulations, staffed them with counterfeit commanders.
If you're going to bring a division up, you better have a headquarters somewhere, and there better be a major general walking around. And so we had to have a fool general do this. Some sergeant would wear 2 stars for an operation.
Our job was to go in with our phony markings and phony stories that we were pretending to be officers and soldiers from another organization. And we were turned loose in town. Go to the pub, order some omelets, and talk loose.
A lot of the guys went to the bakery, got rolls and stuff, and said, we got to get an extra supply because we're moving out tonight, that kind of thing.
It was almost kind of silly, really. But I think what really confirmed the fact that there was effectiveness was sitting in a cafe and seeing a door open up gradually and somebody was taking pictures.
We'd find out if like a division or a special unit had a particular song that they liked to sing. We get blitzed and sing their song.
They threw themselves into their work, I guess you could say. I introduced at the top and mentioned Seymour Nussenbaum, who was a veteran on the unit, who was on the Zoom with us tonight. He is one of the guys who made those fake patches. There were about a dozen guys in what they called the factory section cranking out these counterfeit patches, and Seymour preserved some of them in his scrapbooks that he put together after the war so that we get to see what they looked like. And they used stencils to paint them onto what are called shelter halves or tent canvas, I guess, as we would say. And here in another set of things saved by Seymour, you can actually see the steps that they took in painting a 75th Infantry Division patch, and each color that goes on one piece at a time. And Seymour estimates that they manufactured 40,000 of these patches over the course of the war. Okay, so you have all these means of deception. How do you use them effectively against the enemy? Moving one forward. It starts with a story. What do you want the enemy to believe? What will make the enemy react the way you want them to? Well, you have to create a phony story. What do you want? What's happening? It's the 90th Division moving into position in such and such a place. And then once you've created that story, you feed it to the enemy. But you don't give them everything. Each of the modes of deception we've discussed, visual, sonic, radio, special effects, is a channel through which you feed fragments of the story and you depend on the enemy to piece it together. I think that's the critical piece of the puzzle. It's kind of a weird thought. To me, it is one of the most fascinating things about deception. I talked to a magician about this, a magician who's studied the Ghost Army as well and really thinks they used a lot of techniques from magicians. And he explained it with the phrase you see on the screen. The strongest lies are the lies we tell ourselves. Don't give the enemy all the information on a silver platter. We're not going to do a radio broadcast that says, this is the 70th Division and we're moving in Tuesday at 4 p.m. because nobody's going to buy it. So they have to think that they've discovered the true story from all the little bits and pieces that you've put out there because they're so clever. They need to tell the lie to themselves and then they'll believe it all the more strongly. It's a fascinating piece of psychology that I think can work in a lot of circumstances and helps explain a lot of things, not just with the Ghost Army. So over the course of their time in Europe, they carried out 22 deceptions with some spectacular successes. They contribute to the destruction of the German 9th Army in the Falaise Gap in August 44 by deceiving the enemy about where General Patton is headed. They divert attention away from Patton when he's breaking through to Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. And they conduct their biggest and best deception toward the end of the war when they mask a crossing of the Rhine River by the US Ninth Army. 1,100 guys pretending to be something like 40,000 in that neighborhood and fooling the Germans about where 2 divisions of the Ninth Army are going to cross the Rhine River. By some estimates, they saved 15 to 30,000 lives over the course of their time in Europe. And a top secret US Army report done 30 years later categorized their exploits this way: rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men who had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign. So I believe these guys really were the unsung heroes of the war against Nazi Germany. Now, there's a lot of different aspects to this story. There's another one that's really important that makes it a richer tale that I really want to tell you about. When the US Army created this unit, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, in early 1944, it took pre-existing units and put them together to handle the deception mission. And to handle visual deception, the Army picked the 603rd Camouflage Engineers. That's the unit that Seymour was in. And this was a unit that had a lot of artists in it. About half the guys in the 603rd were artists. The Army had specially recruited artists and had placed them in the camouflage battalion, because if you're doing camouflage, you want people who have artistic knowledge and sensibility. Many of these folks actually studied camouflage because art schools put on camouflage courses before the war, in the run-up to the war, when they knew it was going to be happening. So you take all these artists, plunk them down on the ground in Europe, they start painting and sketching. And that continued for the whole time they were there. The artists of the Ghost Army using stolen moments of spare time to create a visual record of the war. I mean, they painted each other. They painted bombed out buildings. They painted orphan children. This wasn't part of their mission. It's what they did in their off hours. And it began pretty much the moment the first soldiers arrived in Normandy.
A few miles from the Ghost Army's first bivouac was the Normandy village of Treville. The artists were drawn to a bombed-out church off the town square.
These were some of the first sketches I did. They were not too long after the invasion. In the remains of this church, we might have had 3 or 4 guys in there sketching. We were sleeping in hedgerows and foxholes, but nothing kept us away from going someplace to do a watercolor.
I was not the only soldier with a sketchbook. I'd have sketched whether I was the only soldier or not, but to be quite honest with you, I think it helped keep me in balance. I think it kept my sanity.
In the ruins of this church, the soldiers encountered some of the children of the town. I mean, you can imagine if you're a young boy in the town of Treville and there's American soldiers in the church and the church is bombed out, it's a crazy time. You're fascinated by what's going on. And so the soldiers painted some of the children. And here's a painting of a young boy named Paul Grevet. This was done by an artist soldier named John Hapgood. It's kind of more of a sketch than a painting, perhaps. But I've been to Treville many times. We've brought groups of people there, visited the church, done a screening of the film there. And on one of the visits, the mayor of Treville put us in touch with Paul Grevet's family. And eventually, Paul had moved away, but he came back to Treville. And so we got to meet the boy in the painting. And you can see the resemblance very clearly. And by the time we had met Paul Grevet, we had already sent him a copy of the painting. So he was very excited to come and see us. And he had a gift for me. He actually had a gift for me and one for my co-author, Elizabeth Sales. And I want to tell you about that. Actually, I want to show you the gift he gave. But he made a little speech before he gave it to me. And he said, I am a Norman guy. I live in Normandy. And I am giving you a gift that comes all the way from America. And I was like, okay, that sounds kind of interesting. And he gave me this box. And in the box, the first thing in there, I unwrapped it, was a little wooden stand about so big, not very big, about that big. And then the second thing in there, I'm going to hold up. Now, my picture is really small, so I'm also going to see if I can move forward and play a video so that you get a better view of this. Not quite wearing the same set of clothes in the video, but at least you get to see it. It's very heavy, very, very heavy and jagged, as you can see. And I don't know if you can guess what this is, but this is a piece of shrapnel. This is a piece of shrapnel that was once part of a artillery shell fired by a U.S. ship at the church, because of course those church towers were used by snipers and used as observation posts, and they were legitimate military targets. And Paul Greve, as a boy, had found this piece of shrapnel in the church and saved it for 75 years and gave it to me. And what's really special about this to me is that it is a piece of D-Day. And how often do you get to hold a piece of D-Day in your hands? And if I was here with you, I would hand this out to all 338 people who are on the Zoom or would be in the room, so that each of you could hold a piece of D-Day in your hands. There's nothing like that to kind of bring you closer to history. But talking about the artists in the unit, many of these young artists went on to striking post-war careers. Some of them became quite famous. Ellsworth Kelly, the minimalist painter and sculptor, was in the Ghost Army. And if you're at all familiar with the abstract work of his later years, you can see how different it is from the World War II work that you see here that he painted. Another member of the Ghost Army was a 21-year-old kid from Indiana named Bill Blass, who went on to become a fashion superstar. His friend Jack Macy said Bill wore red Vogue in his foxhole, which I think probably separated him out from everybody else. But everybody liked Bill. He was a very positive person. I was told that smile rarely left his face in the time that he was there in Europe with the Ghost Army. And many others as well, not household names, but talented artists with great careers. I used a lot of this art in the film and in the book. We've managed to get it into several different museum exhibits. It's not in one place. It's spread out all over the country in private homes and in libraries and other places. But taken as a whole, it really presents a unique and intimate view of the war that you don't usually get to see. And I think it's an important part of the story. So my wife and I lead a Ghost Army tour for Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. The little advertisement, the next one's at September 2022. Please come. The website's there on the screen. You can follow in the footsteps of the Ghost Army with us. And one stop along the way is the American Cemetery in Luxembourg. 5,076 GIs are buried there under rows of gleaming white crosses. And up front is probably the most famous American soldier in World War II, certainly one of the most famous, killed in a car accident not long after the war's end, George Patton. And his grave is a big tourist attraction. And the buses pull up and people come out and stand around George Patton's grave. And way in the back is the grave of another George, Staff Sergeant George Peddle. I have to tell you, the tourists do not come to George Peddle's grave. He was a radio operator for the 23rd, one of the guys who sent out the phony radio messages designed to attract attention. And they did that all too well on March 14th, 1945, during Operation Bougainville. The enemy opened up on the Ghost Army soldiers, thinking they were a real unit, just as they were about to pull out, in fact. And George Peddle was hit with shrapnel. And I think now that you see the piece of shrapnel I showed you, you know what that can mean when it's shrapnel from an artillery shell. He was badly injured. Men came to his aid. He said, "Don't bother, I'm going to die," which he did. And here's George Peddle a few months before his death with a young boy in Luxembourg. George Peddle was one of 3 men killed and dozens wounded carrying out Ghost Army operations. And his grave is a sobering reminder that although this story certainly has its whimsical aspects, men bled and died to carry off these deceptions. 76 years later, the World War II generation is slipping away. To my knowledge, there are now only 10 men left of the 1,100 that served in this unit. And I don't want this story to die with them. And I think it's worth remembering. I think it's worth remembering and passing on. And that's the reason, or one big reason, I've been involved in setting up a nonprofit, the Ghost Army Legacy Project, to preserve and honor their legacy. And we do have a website, ghostarmy.org, which has a ton of Ghost Army source material there, if you're interested in that. And we've been involved in a bunch of different things. And just to mention a couple, we put up a historical marker in Luxembourg a couple of years ago on the site of one of the Ghost Army operations. It's being unveiled there by veteran Bernie Bluestein, who is also still alive and is a good friend of Seymour Nussenbaum's. And we're putting up another historical marker in France in October. We also took part and assisted in the creation of 2 museum exhibits about the unit that are traveling the country. And this one was at the National World War II Museum and then will be traveling. And because this unit was never really honored appropriately for what they did, we are lobbying Congress to award the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops a Congressional Gold Medal. I mean, these guys labored in secret, using out-of-the-box thinking, creativity, performance to save lives. Then they kept quiet about it for 50 years. Nobody knew what they did. I think it's important to honor that, which is why I've undertaken this effort. And to give you a progress report, we've been working on this for a few years, but we are getting very close now. The legislation's actually passed in the House of Representatives, and it is pending in the US Senate. Now, one of the quirks of gold medal legislation is that you need to get 67 senators to co-sponsor. That's 2/3 of the Senate before it can be considered. Before it even can be considered, you have to have 2/3 of the people basically sign on to it. And we already have 49, which is amazing. We need 18 more. And I will give you a clue you in that Senator Peters of Michigan has co-sponsored. Senator Stabenow of Michigan has not. So all you folks who are watching in Michigan, I hope you can reach out to her, and you can find out on our website how to do that, or you can just find your own way to do that and ask her to co-sponsor S1404, or anybody can ask their senator to co-sponsor that. I really think we're trying to get this done this year, and I really think it's important that we accomplish this. I have met about 50 veterans of this unit, read through the letters and diaries of many others. And I feel a strong bond with Seymour, with the other veterans of the unit. I mean, some of whom I only know through the letters of theirs that I've read. And many of the personal stories are quite fascinating. And it's worth noting that there were a number of Jewish soldiers in this unit. I don't know how many, but anecdotally, I never can pronounce that word. I can say it's a significant number. I introduced you in the beginning to Seymour. Let me give a slightly older photo of Seymour Nussenbaum. I'm sure he's delighted to see that on the screen. This is what he looked like during the war. He was one of the artists in the 603rd. And one of the interesting things about Seymour is that he has been a stamp collector since, I went back and looked at my notes, since about age 6 or 7. And he has a stamp collection that now runs to more than 150 volumes. I didn't check that number with him today, so it might be even more than that. And it's focused primarily on Judaica and Israel. And he even has an envelope sent by the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann. And this collection is curated with incredible care. I want to tell you that these scrapbooks of stamps are essentially works of art, not simply a collection. And at war's end, Seymour applied that collecting focus to the Ghost Army. He created 2 detailed scrapbooks that document his Ghost Army experience. And here he is showing us one of them, showing myself and Roy Eichhorn, who's on our board, one of those scrapbooks. They're filled with pictures and postcards and train tickets, documents, and you can actually scroll through a selection of that material on our website. It's an amazing, amazingly detailed and valuable resource that is now part of the archive at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, I'm happy to say. Now, Seymour's wife, Vera, who sadly passed away a few years ago, was an amazing person in her own right. She left Germany shortly after Kristallnacht, when her mother put her on a Kindertransport, and she never saw her mother again or most of her family. She remembered the German soldiers laughing at them when their train to Holland passed through Berlin. And I said at the beginning that Seymour had a connection with the memorial. Well, it comes through Vera, who was a very connected person. Her cousin is somebody that many of you probably know. I believe she is watching the Zoom tonight. Edith Maniker of West Bloomfield, I hope I have that right, who was also on a Kindertransport to England from Germany in the 1930s, and who has done many programs for this museum. So I was super excited to discover this connection. I always say the Ghost Army is connected to almost everything. I mean, we can connect the Ghost Army to the Munsters TV show, to Marilyn Monroe, to the Seattle Space Needle. Now we found a Ghost Army connection with the Holocaust Memorial of Michigan. So I think that's amazing. This is a picture of Seymour Nussenbaum with 2 other people I've mentioned in the presentation. Seymour's on the right. Next to him is Bernie Bluestein, his friend from the war, who he recently reunited with the day this picture was taken, in fact, after many decades. And over on the left is Stanley Nance, the radio operator we saw earlier, who's 103 years old. He's only the 2nd oldest Ghost Army veteran. The oldest is Gil Seltzer in New Jersey. Gil is 107. Okay. There's only, as I said, 10 of these guys left. This picture of these 3 were taken at the World War II Museum last year. And we're just so lucky that these guys are still with us. One of Seymour's other friends, Seymour, the whole thing is revolving around you. It's pretty. One of Seymour's other friends was a gentleman named Helmut Eisenberg. And I'm quite fascinated by his story. He and his family were Jews who escaped from Nazi Germany in 1935 when he was 16. And you might be interested to know that there were 3 Ghost Army soldiers who were German Jews who fled the Nazis and then joined the US Army and became part of this unit. And Helmut was a Boy Scout, and he was lucky enough as an Eagle Scout to meet and get to know Prince Emmanuel of Liechtenstein. You cannot make this stuff up. And when his family escaped Germany, the prince got them admitted to Liechtenstein. This is a picture of Helmut Eisenberg at age 17 in Liechtenstein, or Liechtenstein, perhaps. And eventually they came to the US. And when the war broke out, he enlisted in the Army. And I just love this transformation. We see this suave European fellow here, and now here's the all-American GI in his helmet, but it's the same guy. He served in the Ghost Army. He then traveled the world after the war, romanced a number of beautiful women, undertook a variety of exotic businesses, and in the end, he wound up back in Germany. He's actually buried at the German cemetery in Wiesbaden. And Seymour has told me how Helmut Eisenberg and he attended Yom Kippur services in Verdun, services held by an Army chaplain in 1944. And he doesn't have the picture in his scrapbook, at least I didn't see it. I found this one on the internet, which says it is the Yom Kippur service in Verdun in 1944, led by Lieutenant Arthur Hellren Saff, a U.S. Army chaplain. I think this only shows a small part of the service. Seymour described it in his scrapbook. He said, "The windows were all broken and the roof leaked, but uncomfortable as we were, I don't think a single one of the fellows would have missed it." And another Ghost Army soldier named Teddy Katz from upstate New York went to the same service. He left a very vivid description in a letter to his wife. We were out in a rain-drenched field up to our ankles in mud when a truck drives up and announced that it would take men to services. Without preliminaries, Sam and I hop on and we wind up in Verdun, bearded, mud-splattered, rifles on our shoulders in a synagogue with only part of the roof left and most of the praying done with the aid of searchlights. Being partly roofless, the place was at the mercy of the elements, consequently being as wet as outdoors. But it was packed with troops come from different places. It was indeed a strange sight. Some lieutenant at the Ark conducting the services over this dark mass of gleaming wet helmets and forest of rifles poking up like dead sticks on a cobblestone street. A lot of treasure involved in the individual lives and stories, and we're learning more about them every day of these guys, and chronicling that is a job that may never be finished. You know, wrapping up here, I want to say 500 years ago, the political philosopher Machiavelli wrote these words: though fraud in all other matters be odious, yet in matters of war, it is laudable and glorious. The men of the Ghost Army were not textbook heroes, yet they served with ingenuity, courage, and honor. They came from many backgrounds, 46 states, maybe a dozen other countries, worked together to use creativity and illusion to defeat a deadly enemy. Then they went home and kept quiet about it for 50 years. I think that's something Machiavelli would find laudable and glorious. I do, and I hope you do too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rick, for such a fascinating talk. Now let's take some questions from the audience. If you have any questions for Rick, please write them down in the Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many as we possibly can. So Rick, one of the first questions is, whose brainchild was this?
So the Ghost Army was basically the brainchild of two American Army officers who were kind of a marriage of opposites. Their names were Ralph Ingersoll and Billy Harris. And Ralph Ingersoll was a celebrity author, journalist who got drafted and ended up in the Army that way. And he was flamboyant. He was involved in Life magazine and Fortune and created his own left-wing newspaper in New York called PM. And in 1944, he's an intelligence officer in London. And his boss is a guy named Billy Harris, a colonel who's the exact opposite of Ralph Ingersoll. He's a button-down West Point guy. You can imagine in a normal lifetime, these guys might never have, come within 3 streets of each other. But here they are thrown together by war. And they are the guys who come up with this idea. And, I think it's really Ralph Ingersoll kind of looking at what the British had done with deception in North Africa, trying to find a way for the Americans to use that. And he's the wild pie in the sky idea guy. And Harris is the how do we make this work guy. And it's the two of them together who come up with it. Shows the power of working with somebody who thinks differently than you do.
That's great. Thank you. People also wanted to know, what kind of basic training did this unit go through? Did they have the standard basic training, or was it something modified? How soldierly were they?
They were very soldierly. I would say that they all went through basic training and standard basic training before they got into the camouflage unit. They all carried weapons with them in World War II, which was mandatory. They mostly didn't have to use them. It doesn't mean that they were necessarily huge on spit and polish. I'm not sure that would be the case. Seymour could answer that better than I could. But they definitely were American soldiers who'd come out of basic training and the regular training for soldiers. They didn't have necessarily a lot of advanced, some of them had advanced training in engineering, in signals, in stuff like that. So they were soldierly. I guess that's the best way to say it.
Thank you. People also want to know, did they have script writers? Were they improvising? How did they come up with the things that they needed to do?
Yes, they definitely had people writing scripts at various times for like all the radio messages that they had to send. And I think they also, had to improvise on occasion. So it's kind of a mix. And I just got a text that said Seymour is there to answer, but I'm not sure if he was there to answer that question. I just don't want to ignore anybody here if he's up. So I see, yeah. So Seymour is present with us, and I don't know if that's the particular question that he would want to answer, but maybe we'll take another question or two and then give him a chance to jump in.
Sure.
Hi, Seymour.
So people want to know, where were the inflatables manufactured, and are there any that are still in existence?
They were manufactured at rubber companies across America, many of them in New England, some in the Midwest, some in the South. To our knowledge, there are none of them still in existence. I wish there were. I don't think they were made of neoprene. It's not a very long-lasting substance. I think they all would have melted by this time. But actually, Seymour has a picture in his scrapbook showing that they burned a lot of the inflatables in Europe before they came home, because they were going to get equipped with new ones before they went to the Pacific. Luckily, they didn't have to go to the Pacific. So that's a positive.
Great, thank you. How many men were physically in the Ghost Army?
There were 1,100 men in the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, which is, the words Ghost Army can be used to describe a lot of things, but there were 1,100 men in the 23rd. And there was also a sister deception unit in Italy that did only sonic deception. And that unit had a couple of hundred people in it. So, and they're included in our Ghost Army Gold Medal bill. But my personal focus has always been on the 23rd, which operated in Europe.
Great. So you mentioned in your talk one time where the Army was attacked. How did they, not being a real unit, but wanting the Germans to think that they were, how did they actually manage to not get attacked more often? Or what system of defense did they have to keep themselves protected?
They didn't have much in the way of heavy weapons, probably nothing more than a 50 caliber machine gun. It's a wonder that they weren't attacked more. I think that they were risking their lives a lot. And I think probably it points to there being a judicious use of the unit. So they were used in circumstances where they could be convincing, and the enemy was convinced that there was more force there than they generally wanted to deal with. But they did they were attacked other times as well. They did lose 3 killed in action, another man who died on the crossing of the Channel, and several dozen who were somewhat seriously wounded, quite seriously wounded, serious enough to be hospitalized and taken away. But yeah, it could have been a lot worse. I'm always, it's a wonder, and I think a very lucky thing that it didn't end up much more difficult than it was. One of the soldiers, Gil Seltzer, who I mentioned, who's 107 now, say when he was told what they were going to do, he thought it was going to be a suicide outfit. So luckily it wasn't.
Having won the war, why do you think the Americans kept the Ghost Army secret for so long?
Because it worked, right? So if you have a secret weapon that works, keep it secret, because you might have somebody else you want to use it against, like the Russians over there. I think that's why. And I think the interesting thing is that there actually was a burst of publicity about this unit in 1945, and then it was hushed up again. I don't think the Army really cared if people knew that they used inflatable tanks or knew that they did deception, but they wanted to keep the details of it and how they coordinated these 4 different types of deception, keep that secret, and make that all work.
Great.
So can I jump in? So I want to give Seymour a chance to. He sat here listening to us for all this time, talk about him and talk about his unit. And Seymour, first of all, I want to say it's great to see you, which I haven't seen you in a while. And I wonder, if there's something that you're burning to add to all this, or if I've gone off track anywhere and you want to correct me in my storytelling.
I don't think you've gone off track at all.
Okay.
I think it's just the way it was. And offhand, I can tell lots of stories, but I prefer to answer questions.
Do we have, Ruth, any questions that would be directed at Seymour that would be appropriate for that?
I am looking, I guess the overall question would be, what were your thoughts and your concerns and your, impressions while you were doing this?
Well, I don't know. I don't think I thought much about it, but I did a lot of praying.
Fair enough.
Not
Fair
much thinking,
enough.
but a lot of praying. And Seymour, I'll ask you a question. You worked on the fake patches, which you saved some of, and what a treasure that is. When you were doing this and you were working, I think Bernie was working on this with you, Bernie Bluestein. Were you thinking, well, this is a really important thing that I'm doing? Or were you thinking, this is crazy work I'm doing? Why am I doing this?
No, I never thought it was crazy work, but I never did try and fathom the minds of the military. So I just did as I was told.
A good. See, I told you they were soldierly.
Soldierly, yes.
That's a good soldierly answer. And Seymour, what did you carry a sidearm? What did you carry?
Well, we started out with the World War I rifles, and then we got carbines.
Yeah, and so a carbine. A lot of the guys carried carbines, and for people who aren't gung-ho weapon guys, a carbine is a much lighter weapon than a standard M1 rifle that the kind of standard GI carried in World War II. It's not very accurate at a range of more than about 100 feet. But if if the regulation says you have to carry something, it's something that you can carry and still do work, right? Whereas if the M1 is so much heavier, it's a lot harder to carry that and kind of work and set up things or work in the field. It's much harder to do with that.
And some people, some people wanted to know what your background is, Mr. Nussenbaum. Is it art, design? What got you put into this unit?
I was attending Pratt Institute in New York, and they had a program on camouflage. And it looked interesting. I figured I was going to go into the Army, so I may as well look into it. And they told us at that class that when we got into the Army, we should let them know that we took these classes, which I did, and which they completely ignored. So they sent me down to some field artillery outfit in Virginia, and I did something very unmilitary. I wrote a letter to the address that they had given us, which we weren't supposed to do, and explained the situation. And one day I was sitting on my bunk, and the first sergeant came over and says, "Who the hell do you know?" I said, "Why?" He says, "You've been transferred." So I ended up at Fort Meade in Maryland.
And there's a number of interesting stories for how people found their way in. And so it's a mix of the Army doing a good job and sometimes people pulling whatever string they could to find a way to be able to use their skills, in a unit as opposed to just being thrown into the general infantry.
I was going to say about our arms. We didn't have M1s. We had Springfield rifles from World War I.
Right, you said that.
Yeah, and then they gave us the carbines. We never had M1s.
You never had M1s. Oh, that's interesting. Okay.
At least not my unit.
So there are three kind of related questions. First, people would like to know, Mr. Nussenbaum, what you did after the war.
I studied illustration at Pratt. And when the war ended, so did the need for illustrators, because they began to use photographs to illustrate stories in magazines. And I was going out with my wife-to-be, and I wanted to get anything I can get, so I'd be working. And I found a job to start an art department and design packages.
So package design.
So I ended up as a package designer, among other things, and I had a very nice career. I enjoyed it. I look forward to going to work.
It's very
Not too
lucky.
bad.
That's great. People also wanted to know, as I said, related questions. What did the Ghost Army do after the last deception? And what did the Army do after the Germans surrendered before they returned home?
Do you mind if I jump in and answer that one, Seymour?
Yeah,
Or no? Okay.
we were sent to Idar Oberstein in Germany to supervise a DP camp.
The DP stands for displaced people.
And it wasn't a Jewish DP camp. It was Russians and Serbs and whatever. And it was interesting. They had stories to tell.
Yeah.
Sure.
And jumping in on that, I would say they guarded. They actually were a number of DP camps that Ghost Army soldiers guarded, and it was well over 100,000 DPs that they were guarding for a while. Then they eventually were brought back to the U.S. In July, if I remember correctly, of 1945, and everybody was given leave, or most of the soldiers were given leave for a couple of weeks until they were going to be brought back together and shipped out to the Pacific. And while they were on leave, the atomic bomb was dropped, and General MacArthur let. Well,
I wasn't on leave. My leave was over.
Your leave was over? Okay.
Yeah, they gave us 31 days, and then they told me to report to Pine Camp, New York.
Right.
And I did, and we were there for a little while when the war ended.
So the atomic bomb ended the need for them to go to the Pacific.
Wow. So I think we have time for just one or two more questions. People want to know, how were the inflatables transported between sites, and were they deflated and reinflated? And was there any suspicion from the enemy at all that the Ghost Army was a ghost army?
As far as we know, they never knew.
Yeah, I agree with that. And they had trucks. We saw a picture early in the presentation where we saw an inflatable truck and two trucks in bags. So that's what they look like deflated. You could fit 30 of them in a truck. So yeah, you definitely deflated them. Seymour, do you remember how long it took to inflate or deflate a tank or a truck?
Depends on what it was. The big ones took longer, but it was in the about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
With compressors.
Right.
If you could inflate them by mouth, it took considerably longer.
Right.
And you have to remember that they don't have one or two to deflate. They might have 15 or 20, or in Operation Viersen, they had more than 600 dummies that were used in that final operation they did. So they've got a lot of guys doing it, but it could still take a little while if you have that kind of volume.
Well, Rick, thank you so much. If you'd like to order a copy of Rick's book, Ghost Army of World War II, we will post the link on the chat for you so you can order. And we'd also like to thank Seymour Nussenbaum from the 603rd Camouflage Engineers for joining us this evening. Truly, truly, what a wonderful honor and the opportunity to speak with you and meet you this evening. Thank you again to our program supporters, community partners, and donors. We truly appreciate everything that you do to support the Holocaust Memorial Center. We're able to offer events free of charge because of the generosity of caring supporters like you. Please consider making a donation by visiting holocaustcenter.org/support. Our new special exhibit, The Girl in the Diary, Searching for Rivka from the Lodz Ghetto, is now open. The exhibit is based on a diary discovered in Auschwitz-Birkenau after World War II. Written by a Jewish teenager living in the Lodz Ghetto, the diary offers a moving glimpse into lives interrupted by the Holocaust. This exhibit was created by the Galicia Jewish Museum in Krakow, Poland, in cooperation with the Jewish Historical Institute in Warsaw. On Wednesday, September 1st, Associate Professor of History Derek Hastings will present his lecture, Rivka's Diary, A Girl Lost, a Diary Found. He will further explore the historical context within which Rivka's diary was written, focusing on the nature of life under Nazi rule in the ghetto. To register to attend this in-person lecture or attend virtually via Zoom, visit holocaustcenter.org/diary. Have a good evening.